Hi, this is Mr. Koffs doing a Friday wrap-up of the steps to the Civil War in the 1850s. I'm going to use the 13 different entries for the journals that we're doing that are due next week. And it's really topic APUSH period 5, topic 3 through 7. So 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 sort of highlighted. And it starts off with this whole incident in the late 1840s after the Mexican War about what to do with the land in the West. And should the soil be free? And we see different third parties set up in this whole free soil movement. The question with the Wilmot Proviso, which is a congressman from Pennsylvania who's asking, can we make all Western territory acquired in the Mexican War not have slaves? And of course, because Congress at this point in the Senate is gridlocked, it's 50-50, that's not going to pass. But it's really pulling a Band-Aid off of the Missouri Compromise. Okay, so the Missouri Compromise wasn't really a solution to slavery, it was a temporary fix in 1820. So essentially what happens is now 1850 comes, 1820 is the Missouri Compromise, 1850 comes, and in 1850 California wants to enter as a free state because they had the gold rush in 1849, like the San Francisco 49ers nickname. And so they're flooded with people. Now the country, even though Taylor's from the South and a slave owner is president, wants California as a state because there's so much money at stake. Like, it's so lucrative. All that gold is like $50, $100 million a year being shipped to Eastern markets. So we have to let them as a state, but it will disrupt the balance 1615. So Henry Clay, the same guy, the great compromiser, the old man, comes up with a 5-part proposal to try to get through Congress to try to get it passed. Okay? And he and Calhoun and Webster make these like last grand speeches of their lives trying to get this compromise passed. It doesn't pass, but a young senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, sort of takes the reins on it and politics it through Congress. So what is the Compromise 1850? It's 5 parts. And one that is going to make sense to you is absorbing Texas's debt. Well, why would absorbing Texas's debt be a part of this? Well, Texas is a southern slave state, but they've accumulated a large debt because they were their own country for 9 years. Well, if you make a deal and tell the Texas senators, hey, if you pass California as a free state, we'll absorb your debt, you can see how they got enough votes even though it was tied. What ended up mattering about the compromise? Well, the federal fugitive slave law enforcement made Northerners really mad. The banning of the DC slave trade, I mean, that needed to happen. It's not like that made anyone really mad. What really was the crux of the most important part was the admission to California as a free state, because the balance becomes 1615. Once California enters the Union, white southern slave owners are starting to see that there are issues in the future because as this country grows, the federal government's going to get rid of their most, in their minds, important thing, which is the right to hold slaves. So this is going to be really the beginning of this tension where the South feels like, what are we doing in this country? Where's our state's right to keep slaves? In the North, working with the West is starting to be a country that's saying, what are we doing with slaves? It's a moral wrong. And we don't want it expanding in the West. We want the West to be free. So what we see is, forward 4 years later, 1854, and I know on the video it's backwards, the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory want to be states. It's actually one territory, but we divided in 2. And again, Stephen Douglas, again the same guy, Stephen Douglas, from Illinois, politics through the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is popular sovereignty, which means let the people in these 2 territories vote. Nebraska is going to go vote free, but Kansas is going to turn into bleeding Kansas with all of this bloodshed that happens, and this is in 1854. So 1854, bleeding Kansas is a result because all the pro and con slavery people flood into Kansas and they fight trying to influence the vote. So the Civil War sort of starts 10 years or 8 years early, 7 years early, 6 years early in Kansas. And what we see is we also see violence spread on the floor of the House and the Senate, where congressmen are bringing pistols and weapons into Congress because Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, took his cane and savagely beat Charles Sumner, a northern congressman, and almost killed him, like smashed his whole face open, fractured his skull. And so we're seeing this violence of this tension of North and South spilling into the halls of Congress. Now there's a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1851-1852. Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes this book, and Lincoln will say, well, if it isn't the little lady that started the big war 10 years later, but the book was so widely read and so influential. Queen Victoria cries when she reads the book in England. I mean, the book was worldwide spread. And what did it do? It's just a book. I mean, it's sort of historical fiction. But she interviewed slaves, and it told the tale of the grim reality of slavery. Which, I mean, now we look back like, yeah, duh. But for a lot of people that are just living their lives on their farms and going to church once a week throughout this country that are in the North, they didn't realize that this slave relationship was like as horrific as it was. Perhaps they should have paid closer attention, because this made Americans very emotional, and it made Southerners very defensive. So this book is a great contributor. Now the Whig Party, W-H-I-G, the party of Zachary Taylor and William Henry Harrison, we had presidents that were elected as Whigs. They sort of replaced the National Republicans, who replaced the Federalists. The Whig Party is going to dissipate over the slavery issue. The Whigs and the Democrats are split north and south, but the Whigs disappear. And that vacuum is filled by a new party called the Republican Party. The Republican Party has one issue: to stop the spread of slavery into new territories. And if you're BOCES people, or you're not here, and you want credit that you watched this, this is the moment. You need to tell me what the Republican Party is in detail, that I'll know that you watched that. Nobody in here tipped those people. If they want the credit for being here, they need to watch this through. The Republican Party had one issue: stop the spread of slavery in the West. And they recruited a lot of former Northern abolitionist Whigs. Most prominently, Governor, Senator from New York State, William Seward. That's a big get for this new party. And as we know, young Abraham Lincoln becomes a Republican, leaves the Whig Party. A lot of Northern Republicans are from Northern Whigs, because the Whigs disappeared. So we got a new political party. In 1857, Dred Scott, a man that lived free, a former slave, a black man, lived free for over a decade in Illinois, in Minnesota, and Wisconsin with his Army colonel, former master. But when he died, his family wanted their property back, and he argued that he was a free man and that it wasn't fair that he be enslaved again. And the court heard the case, and Chief Justice Roger B. Taney basically said that black men weren't entitled to constitutional rights, that those were for whites only. Imagine that. So 1857. That decision is only going to get reversed by the 13th Amendment 8 years later. But that decision has heavy impact on the mentality of abolitionists in the North that feel like, what kind of country are we living in, where our own Supreme Court's basically saying that human beings born here don't have any rights? All right? Flash forward to 1858, Illinois Senate race takes center stage because future President Abraham Lincoln, who's a relative nobody at this time, is debating the most famous politician in the country, even more famous than the crappy 15th President James Buchanan, and that is Stephen A. Douglas. And their debates throughout the state of Illinois that are publicized throughout the country are making Abraham Lincoln a known name, because he's such a good public speaker and makes such strong argument of the morality of slavery and how immoral it is and how wrong it is. So he paints the picture of slavery as immoral. And that's really important, because that's going to give him the momentum in the election of 1860 to run for president, which is a surprise. He only got the nomination because he's more of a state on the border with the South, and they saw Seward as almost too much of an abolitionist. So Lincoln sort of steals the Republican nomination from Seward, from Chase, from these others, and essentially Lincoln becomes shockingly elected 16th president because the Democrats, who really had the most enrollment in the country, couldn't run their same candidate because the Southern Democrats wouldn't support Stephen Douglas because he took a position that was not strong enough for slavery for them. So they run a guy named Breckinridge. And it's not even enough. The Virginians run a candidate named John Bell in their own constitutional union party. So what we see is a 4-horse race that Abraham Lincoln somehow wins an electoral majority, even though he barely got 40% of the popular vote. When Lincoln gets elected, that is the beginning of a chain reaction of southern states, starting with South Carolina, leaving the Union. The word we use is secede. To them, they saw the writing on the wall, and they bolted, they dipped, because they didn't see that this country was in any position to support their future of their necessity economically for slavery, and they felt that they had a state right to have slaves, and they would have never joined this country in the first place if they knew they couldn't get out of it if it did this. Okay? Now, one last thing, the influence of John Brown. Perhaps the meteor, as Herman Melville called him, of the entire war. John Brown becomes a martyr. He becomes a villain throughout the South. He becomes a hero to many abolitionists, but he single-handedly thinks that 18 people can go into Harper's Ferry, Virginia with a few guns, steal more from the federal arsenal, and single-handedly kill slave owners, recruit their slaves for an army, roll to the next town, and town by town, be able to pull off the impossible to end slavery all by themselves. John Brown's plan is foiled. A few of his own sons are killed. And really, the slaves didn't rise up to help him. Angry townspeople did rise up to hurt him. And of all people, U.S. Colonel Robert E. Lee, former or future Confederate general, is the one that actually apprehends John Brown, and he gets executed. And he says that he believes, his last words are a note that he passes, that he believes that the only way that this evil slavery will ever end is through bloodshed. And isn't that the truth? Because we're going to have a war where more Americans die in the Civil War than every other American war combined. Over 600,000 Americans die. It literally wipes out a whole segment of our young adult male population. And that's all I got to say about that. Thank you.